Welcome back to Real World Enterprise Architecture. This is a podcast for architects who are tired of pretending that organizations are rational systems. For those who have already noticed that the hardest architectural decisions are rarely technical and almost always political. And for those who are starting to realize that influence inside complex organizations requires more than good analysis and clean diagrams. Today, we're going to talk about something many architects claim to hate: office politics. And for a lot of professionals, that phrase immediately triggers resistance. They associate politics with manipulation, hidden agendas, favoritism, and people playing games behind the scenes. And because of that association, many architects adopt a position that sounds virtuous on the surface. They say they prefer to stay neutral, to focus on facts, to remain objective. They want to believe that if their analysis is rigorous enough, the organization will eventually do the right thing. But that belief collapses the moment architecture begins to matter. Because the moment your architectural work starts affecting budgets, ownership, priorities, or authority, you are no longer operating in a purely analytical environment. You are operating inside a political system. Different leaders want different outcomes. Different departments protect different interests. Different initiatives compete for the same attention, the same resources, and the same legitimacy. And architecture sits exactly at that intersection, which means something architects often find uncomfortable but eventually have to accept. Politics is not a side effect of architecture. Politics is the environment in which architecture lives. The problem is that many architects respond to this reality in one of two ways. Some try to avoid politics completely. They retreat into analysis, frameworks, and governance processes, hoping this structure will protect them from the messiness of organizational dynamics. Others go into the opposite direction. They become cynical. They start playing games, building alliances purely for advantage, and manipulating decisions to maintain influence. Neither path produces good architecture. Avoiding politics makes you irrelevant. Embracing manipulation makes you dangerous. The real challenge is something much harder: learning to operate inside political environments without losing your integrity. Understanding how power eventually moves inside organizations, how decisions are really shaped, how influence is exercised, not to dominate others, but to prevent architecture from becoming ornamental. Because the truth is simple: if you refuse to engage with politics, architecture loses. Not because your DSI are wrong, but because someone else is willing to play the game. And they will. One of the most naive beliefs I still hear from architects is the idea that politics only appears when something unethical is happening. That politics begins when someone manipulates information, protects their territory, or pushes an agenda behind closed doors. But that's not where politics begins. Politics begins the moment interests diverge inside the system. And in organizations, interests diverge constantly. Different departments optimize for different outcomes. Different leaders carry different risks. Different teams protect different priorities. Finance worries about cost control. Operations worries about stability. Product teams worry about speed. Technology teams worry about scalability and maintainability. Sales worries about responsiveness. None of these priorities are wrong, but they are not always compatible. And when they collide, decisions stop being purely analytical. They become political. Not because someone is behaving badly, but because the organization has to decide whose priorities matter most in that moment. Architecture sits exactly at the center of these collisions. Every architectural recommendation redistributes something: ownership, control, budget, authority. Propose consolidating platforms and someone loses authority. Propose a shared capability and someone loses control over their roadmap. Propose governance and someone loses freedom of action. Even when the recommendation is objectively sound, its consequences are never neutral. This is why architects who believe they can remain purely technical often find themselves confused by what happens next. They present a well structured analysis, they explain the benefits, they demonstrate the long term value, and then the organization hesitates, or resists, or quietly ignores the recommendation. From the architect's perspective, the reaction feels irrational. But from the organization's perspective, something entirely rational is happening. People are protecting their position in the system. And that brings us to a concept many architects prefer not to name directly: power. Power is not a dirty word in organizations. It is simply the capacity to influence decisions. Sometimes that capacity comes from formal authority, titles, badges, governance rights, but very often it comes from somewhere else: experience, reputation, relationships, institutional memory. Sometimes the most powerful person in a decision is not the one with the highest title. It's the one whose opinion others quietly wait for before committing. Architects who ignore this dynamic often assume that formal structure tells the whole story. But organizations rarely operate according to their org chart. They operate according to how power actually flows. Understanding that flow is not manipulation, it is situational awareness. And without it, architecture becomes surprisingly fragile. Because architectural reasoning alone rarely determines the outcome of important decisions. What determines the outcome is the interaction between reasoning, incentives, and power. This is where one of the oldest texts on political behavior becomes unexpectedly relevant. Niccolo Machiavelli wrote The Prince more than 500 years ago. It's often misinterpreted as a manual for manipulation or ruthless ambition. But if you read it carefully, what Machiavelli is really describing is something much simpler: how power behaves when interests collide. His central observation is uncomfortable but difficult to refute. People rarely make decisions based purely on abstract principles. They make decisions based on incentive, risks, and survival. Now, before anyone jumps to the wrong conclusion, let me be clear. I am not suggesting that architects should become Machiavellian. Architecture does not require cynicism, but it absolutely requires realism. Machiavelli understood something many modern professionals still struggle to accept: good intentions do not neutralize power dynamics. If a decision threatens someone's position, they will respond. Sometimes openly, sometimes subtly, sometimes by challenging the analysis, sometimes by delaying the process, sometimes by quietly building support for an alternative direction. None of this necessarily means someone is acting unethically. It simply means the system is responding to pressure. Architects who refuse to see this often interpret resistance as ignorance, irrationality, or lack of strategic thinking. But most of the time, the resistance is perfectly rational from the perspective of the people affected by the change. They are not reacting to the architecture, they are reacting to the implications of the architecture. And that distinction matters. Because if you treat every disagreement as a technical misunderstanding, you will spend your energy improving explanations instead of understanding incentives. You will produce better diagrams, better documentation, better roadmaps, and none of them will change the outcome. This is the moment where many architects experience a quiet crisis. They realize that being correct is not enough. And the uncomfortable question emerges: if decisions are influenced by power dynamics, how can architects participate in that environment without becoming manipulative? That question is where the conversation usually becomes uncomfortable, because the word politics carries a heavy moral weight. Many professionals want to believe that integrity requires staying above politics, but in reality, integrity does not mean avoiding politics. Integrity means engaging with it without becoming corrupt by it. Understanding how influence works is not unethical. What matters is how you use that understanding. And this is where a different leadership perspective becomes useful. In ego free leadership, Brandon Bragg and Shane Hughes describe leadership not as a dominance or control, but as responsibility for the system you influence. An ego driven leader tries to win, an ego free leader tries to steward outcomes. That distinction is crucial for architects because architects operate in environments where decisions shape the long term structure of the enterprise. If you refuse to engage politically, you leave those decisions entirely to others. And those others may not be thinking about long term coherence at all. They may be thinking about quarterly targets, departmental autonomy, personal reputation, or simply minimizing risk. An architect who understands politics but refuses manipulation occupies a very different position. They observe how influence moves. They understand which tensions matter. They recognize where resistance originates. And instead of pretending those forces do not exist, they work with them consciously, not to dominate the system, but to prevent the system from drifting into incoherence. That requires something many architects underestimate: not intelligence, not technical expertise, judgment. Judgment about when to push, when to pause, when to escalate tension, and when to let a conversation evolve. Because navigating politics responsibly is not about playing games. It is about recognizing that architecture lives inside human systems. And human systems are never neutral. They are shaped by incentives, power, and competing priorities. At this point, it is worth looking at something that happens far more often than most architects realize. Architects lose influence slowly, not through open conflict, not through failure, and almost never through technical mistakes. They lose influence quietly. It begins with small adjustments. An architect softens a recommendation because the room feels tense. A contradiction is reframed as something to analyze further. A decision that should be forced into the open is postponed in the name of alignment. Each of these choices feels reasonable in the moment, but over time, a pattern emerges. The architect stops being the person who forces clarity. They become the person who maintains harmony, and harmony in complex organizations is often just unresolved tension disguised as agreement. This is one of the most dangerous traps in architectural practice. Architects start believing their role is to reflect the organization's consensus rather than reveal where consensus does not exist. Instead of saying these two initiatives cannot both succeed under the current operating model, they say we may want to explore how these initiatives could coexist. Instead of saying this roadmap is politically convenient but operationally unrealistic, they say there may be some delivery risks we should keep in mind. The language becomes careful, diplomatic, safe, and slowly the architect's voice loses weight because people sense something important. This person will not force the system to confront itself. Meetings remain calm, discussions remain polite, everyone leaves the room feeling respected, but the real decisions begin to happen somewhere else. Not because the architect is wrong, but because the architect is no longer shaping the tension that produces decisions. Organizations rarely change through calm agreement, they change through friction, through moments where competing priorities are forced into the open and someone has to decide which direction matters more. When architects remove that friction from the conversation, they unintentionally remove themselves from leadership. And here is the subtle irony. Many architects believe that avoiding political tension protects their credibility. In reality, it erodes it, because credibility in complex organizations does not come from being agreeable. It comes from being reliable in moments of uncertainty. People trust the person who is willing to say what others are carefully avoiding. Not recklessly, not aggressively, but clearly. And this is where political awareness becomes essential. Political awareness is not the ability to manipulate outcomes, it's the ability to understand what is actually happening in the room. Who feels threatened by a decision? Who benefits from delaying it? Who is silently waiting for someone else to take responsibility? Who has influence even without formal authority? and who will quietly undermine a direction if they feel excluded from it. Architects who lack this awareness often misinterpret resistance. They think they are facing technical disagreement when the real issue is loss of control. They think they are facing misunderstanding when the real issue is misaligned incentives. They think they are facing irrational behavior when the real issue is fear. Once you begin to see these dynamics, the conversation changes. Instead of repeating the same architectural arguments, you start asking different questions. What does this decision threaten? Who actually owns the consequences? What incentives are shaping the reaction we are seeing? What kind of tension is the organization trying to avoid right now? These questions move the conversation from analysis to judgment. And judgment is where architectural leadership actually lives, because the architect who understands the political landscape of the organization can do something far more powerful than simply present recommendations. They can shape the conditions under which decisions happen. They can surface contradictions earlier. They can frame trade offs more honestly. They can prevent architectural discussions from collapsing into polite ambiguity. But doing this requires something that many architects underestimate: courage. Not dramatic courage, not heroic speeches, the quieter kind. The willingness to ask a question that makes the room pause. The willingness to say, these two priorities are incompatible. Which one matters more? The willingness to hold tension long enough for the organization to actually see itself. That is political competence in practice. And without it, architecture becomes something else entirely: a documentation exercise, a modeling activity, a collection of diagrams that describe the enterprise more accurately than they influence it. And architecture that does not influence decisions is not architecture, it is decoration. At this point, a reasonable concern usually appears. If organizations are political systems and if architectural influence requires understanding those dynamics, where is the line between responsible leadership and manipulation? It's a fair question. Because the moment you start talking about politics in organizations, people assume the conversation is about tactics, alliances, and hidden agendas. They imagine a game where the objective is to win influence at any cost. That is not the conversation we're having. Understanding politics does not mean embracing manipulation. It means understanding the environment where decisions actually happened. There is a profound difference between playing games and understanding the game. Manipulation is about controlling people. Political competence is about understanding incentives, tensions, and power dynamics so that important decisions are not quietly derailed. Manipulation seeks personal advantage. Responsible influence seeks organizational clarity. One corrodes trust, the other protects the integrity of decisions that affect the entire enterprise. The distinction is subtle but essential, and this is where many architects become uncomfortable. Because once you understand how influence moves inside organizations, you lose the comfort of pretending that neutrality is enough. You start noticing patterns you previously ignored. You notice who speaks last before decisions close. You notice whose concerns are taken seriously and whose are politely acknowledged and then forgotten. You notice how certain incentives gain momentum quickly while others stall without explanation. You begin to see that many architectural debates are not about architecture at all. They are about ownership, autonomy, control, risk. Once you see these dynamics clearly, you face a choice. You can pretend they don't exist and continue presenting purely technical arguments, or you can engage with reality responsibly. Engaging with reality does not require manipulation, it requires awareness. It means recognizing when a conversation is actually about incentives rather than analysis. It means understanding which tensions must be surfaced and which ones must be handled carefully. It means knowing when pushing harder will produce clarity and when pushing harder will simply trigger defensive behavior. This is where the perspective from ego-free leadership becomes particularly useful. The book makes a simple but powerful distinction between ego-driven leadership and responsibility-driven leadership. An ego-driven leader wants to win the argument. A responsibility-driven leader wants the organization to face reality. Those are not the same thing. Winning an argument may satisfy your ego, but it does not necessarily improve the enterprise. For architects, this distinction matters enormously because architectural influence is rarely about proving you are right. It is about helping the organization see trade offs clearly enough to make better decisions. Sometimes that means pushing hard, sometimes it means stepping back. Sometimes it means allowing tension to sit in the room without immediately resolving it. And sometimes it means recognizing that a technically imperfect decision may still be the right one for the organization at that moment. Architects who treat every disagreement as a battle to win eventually lose trust. Architects who refuse to engage with disagreement lose influence. The path between those extremes requires maturity. It requires separating your identity from your recommendations. It requires the discipline to ask yourself a difficult question before pushing a position forward. Am I trying to prove something, or am I trying to help the system see itself clearly? The difference may not be visible to you immediately, but it is almost always visible to everyone else in the room. This is why integrity matters so much in political environments. Without integrity, political awareness quickly becomes manipulation. With integrity, political awareness becomes leadership. Integrity does not mean refusing to participate in political dynamics. It means refusing to exploit them for personal advantage. It means being transparent about your reasoning. It means being consistent in your principles even when the pressure to bend them becomes uncomfortable. And it means remembering that the ultimate purpose of enterprise architecture is not to win debates. It is to help organizations make coherent decisions about their future. That responsibility becomes even more important when the system itself is confused, when priorities shift every quarter, when leadership hesitates to commit, when initiatives multiply faster than the organization can absorb them. In those moments, architects who understand the political landscape can do something extremely valuable. They can stabilize the conversation. They can redirect attention toward the trade offs that actually matter. They can prevent architectural discussions from collapsing into vague optimism or bureaucratic process, not by dominating the room, but by refusing to let the organization hide from its own contradictions. That is what responsible political competence looks like. It is not glamorous, it does not always make you popular, but it makes architecture relevant. And relevance in complex organizations is the difference between shaping the future of the enterprise and merely documenting its past. Before we close this episode, there is one more thing that needs to be said, because many architects listening to this might still be thinking something like this. I understand that politics exists, but I'd rather stay out of it. And on the surface, that sounds noble. It sounds principled. It sounds like professionalism. But in reality, that position often hides a misunderstanding about how organizations work. Choosing to stay out of politics does not remove politics from your environment. It simply removes you from the conversations where power is being exercised. And the consequence is predictable. Decisions still get made. Trade-offs still happen. Roadmaps still move forward. Architectural consequences still accumulate. They just happened without architectural influence. And then, months later, someone asks the architecture team to review the situation, to assess the damage, to create diagrams explaining how the system became so complex, to propose a roadmap that somehow fixes everything that was allowed to drift. That is not architectural leadership, that is architectural archaeology. You arrive after the decisions are already embedded in the system. You document them, you rationalize them, you try to repair them, but you did not shape them. And if you're serious about the profession of enterprise architecture, that should bother you. Because architecture was never meant to be passive. It was meant to shape the direction of the enterprise before complexity becomes irreversible, which means that architects cannot afford the luxury of pretending that organizational politics are someone else's problem. If you want influence, you must understand the environment where influence operates. And that environment is not purely technical. It never has been. Now, let me be clear about something. Understanding politics does not mean becoming cynical. It does not mean becoming manipulative. And it certainly does not mean abandoning your integrity. In fact, the opposite is true. In political environments, integrity becomes even more important because it becomes the anchor that prevents influence from turning into opportunism. And that balance, understanding power while preserving integrity, is one of the hardest things an architect must learn. It's also one of the least discussed topics in architecture education. Most training programs will teach you frameworks, they will teach you modeling techniques, they will teach you governance structures. Very few will teach you how influence actually moves inside organizations. Very few will talk about power. Very few will prepare you for the moment when the technically correct answer conflicts with someone's authority, budget, or strategic narrative. But that moment will come. And when it does, your ability to navigate it responsibly will determine whether architecture remains relevant or quietly ignored. And this brings us to the reason this episode exists, because learning to operate in political environments without losing your soul is not something that can be summarized in a few sentences. It requires a deeper conversation, a conversation about power, about integrity, about influence, and about the boundaries architects must maintain if they want to remain credible while operating in environments that are not always clean or transparent. So, in a future episode, part 2 of this topic, we're going to go deeper into exactly that. We will talk about how power actually operates inside organizations, how informal authority shapes architectural decisions, and how architects can build influence without becoming the kind of political operator they once criticized. Because playing the game responsibly is possible, but pretending the game does not exist is not, and that distinction matters more than most architects realize. Now, let me close this with a small rant. If your entire strategy as an architect is to avoid politics, then you are not protecting your integrity. You are protecting your comfort. And organizations rarely reward comfort. They reward clarity. They reward courage. They reward the people who are willing to engage with reality instead of hiding behind frameworks. Frameworks are useful, but they do not protect architecture from politics. People do. Leaders do. Architects who are willing to understand power without surrendering their principles do. And that is the kind of architect this podcast is really about. The kind who sees the system clearly, speaks honestly about it, and still chooses to act with integrity. Because the architecture is not just about designing systems, it's about shaping the conditions under which organizations make decisions. And that requires more than diagrams. It requires judgment, it requires maturity, and sometimes it requires the courage to step into conversations that most people would prefer to avoid. My name is Marco Fernandez, and this is Real World Enterprise Architecture. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next episode.